Well, Rotta the Hutt has finally hit the holotables in episode 3 of era number 3, the era of New Republic, and he is really ripping up the Coliseum leaderboards and throwing everybody for a loop because he is a one-man wrecking crew and everybody and their mother seems to have him at era level 110. But the question that I actually have, and I have had since the beginning of this era, was whether or not Rada was going to be more expensive than Maul before him. And as you recall, in the era of Andor, CG really lost the plot in the end and gave us all of the materials for free because they messed up the conversion charts to this new era. So it's hard to compare to the era of Andor, and we do need to bring this back to the era of Maul. Now, I have seen some people talking about this, but I do think that there are parts of this conversation that they're missing, and I do want to go over all of it to give that cost analysis as fair a shot as possible. So with that said, let's get into it. Now, before I actually show you the infographics, I want to paint a picture on the era of anniversaries versus the era of New Republic because functionally they are very different. Just remember that in the era of anniversaries, players were able to purchase the MK packs in Coliseum from level 1 all the way to level 7 right from the very beginning. And what that meant was if you were a whale and you wanted to be on the top of your Coliseum, it was very beneficial to purchase packs that maybe you wouldn't have needed if you had waited towards the end of the era to get those characters. But that was the only way for you as a player to get the era currency and to make sure that you were in the top 10. However, in the era of New Republic, things have shifted. CG has increased the cost on some of the lower tier packs, decrease the cost on some of the higher tier packs, split those packs in two, still seemingly a little bit cheaper, but they've only offered one additional pack per 2 week cycle, which has meant that players who are aiming to get Rada to 7 stars didn't actually need to ever buy an MK1 through MK6 pack at all. Now, arguably, there were some players who were only focused on the journey guide. They didn't care about the Colosseum at all, and this would not be pertinent to them. But keeping in mind that the majority of big spenders were also trying to stay on top of their Colosseum, that is an added cost that came with the era of anniversaries and the era of Andor that didn't necessarily exist in the era of New Republic because it just wasn't necessary. Now, it has been impossible for us to talk about cost until now, specifically because we didn't have the cost in the MK7 and the MK8 packs, and we didn't know what the Xeric modules or the Xeric materials, or as some people call them, honeypots, how many of those would be available in the higher level marquees. We do have all of that information now, so let's kind of go over and see what this looks like for Rotta the Hutt. I'm going to pull this up. Keep in mind that this infographic is specifically focused on just the MK7 and MK packs that you need to get in order to get Rada to 7 stars. It has nothing to do with the marquee packs. It has nothing to do with actually bringing the characters to 7 in the era versus any other era. And it looks like right now the best path that you can go if you want to bring Rada to 7 stars by the end of this era is to buy the Mark 7 calendar, to ignore the Mark 8 calendar, and then you can see below the amount of packs that you actually need of each of the individual pack purchases. Now, the reason we're going to ignore the Mark 8 calendar is because there's a lot of excess MK8A material in there. And that is really great if you want to bring your characters past the requisite era level of 125, but it's actually cheaper just to buy the packs themselves instead of the calendar if you are looking for a cost-effective way to do this. You'll save about 18 or so dollars. Now, if you do buy the Mark 8 calendar, you will be able to bring your characters up a few additional era levels, which will equate to an additional relic level at the end of the era. But because it is a lower relic level, I believe it's relic 4 to relic 5, and because the majority of those materials are effectively free for the majority of players who are going to be doing this, it is not something that I am personally going to be recommending. One other thing to really consider here is that because Snowtrooper Commander, all of the materials that you need to get from the MK7 from him and the Xeric to get from him are in the 5-star tier, it does mean that you will not have to get him to 7 stars in day one. And if you recall, in the era of Maul, the era of anniversaries, you needed to bring Marquee 5 and Marquee 6 to 7 stars on day one in order to get the Xeric materials. In the era of Andor, you didn't need to do this specifically and only because CG forgot to convert Xeric materials and decided to just let it play out. So you were able to just do the 6-star trick to bring those characters to 7, though that was an unintended consequence of their own failures there, right? So the total Rotta pack cost, once you've gotten to this point, is effectively $266.71 on top of your purchases of the marquees. And there are a couple ways that you would be able to do that. But if we were to say that you bought the episode pass each time and you bought the $99 pack each time, that is 660, 860, so about $920 complete, totally in and done. There are ways that you could have done a lot of this cost with crystals if you are a hoarder, but overall your converted cost is going to be somewhere around that 900, what did I say, 920, I believe it was, right? So 600, 660, 760, 860, so about $920, right? When we pull this over to Rotta, this is what that total pack cost is going to look like. $226 in packs, $40 in the Mark 7 calendar. Once again, we see the total Rotta pack cost is about $266. But how does that compare to Maul, right? So when we look at Maul here, our pack costs are $200. Now, this is something that's a little bit divisive. I spent a good deal of time yesterday trying to find this information, and I heard numbers anywhere as low as about $190 and as high as about $230. So we're going to use 200 as our pack cost basis. And that appears to be cheaper. However, as I mentioned earlier, in order to get the Xeric materials in the era of Maul, you needed to 7-star your 5th and 6th Marquee on day one. And there were a couple of ways of doing this, but the cheapest way to do it was to buy the 10 pull pack, which I think is actually 12 pulls for 12,290, somewhere around there. 12,000 or so crystals, which equals out to a rough equivalent of $78. So the total Maul cost is actually somewhere around $356, not including any of the MK1 through MK6 packs that you may have bought because you needed to stay on top of your Coliseum. One other thing to note is that one thing that is not being taken into account for Rotta or for Maul is the era leveling currency amounts. Those era leveling currency amounts are going to be effectively and roughly the same between the two eras that we have seen, technically three eras that we have seen. And overall, a lot of that can be mitigated by waiting a little longer if you wanted to, or offsetting with some of the cheaper, smaller crystal packs. I personally found that when buying the marquee packs and using the Kessel run and getting crystals from the Kessel run, that I could use a fraction of those crystals that I was earning for free from the Kessel run to purchase any era leveling currency that I happen to need. And I do know that some players ended up buying the Pass Plus, which would reduce their overall shard cost, and would give them overall more era leveling currency because of the 10 extra levels. So we are not including that at all here. But effectively, what this means is that even though there are some complications with Rotta, even though there are some issues with their rewards for Rotta, even though some of the costs actually appear to be bigger for Rotta, that Rotta actually ends up being roughly $100 cheaper than Maul in the end, right? And that's a pretty big, important deal because if you remember, before the eras came to the game, in order to get a 7-star Journey Guide character, you literally only needed to get the characters to 7-star, and you could do that through the 7-day or 1-week trick. All of the relic materials that you needed, while technically a cost, the majority of whales or the majority of players who were doing this were able to get those relic materials for free through their normal gameplay. When eras came to the game, now requiring all of these era levels and era Coliseum and Coliseum levels, the cost to get a journey guide significantly increased by, again, roughly somewhere around the $200 to $300 range. But it looks like Rotta's era is bringing that cost down slightly by about $100. And that to me is really important. One thing that I do want to note before we end here, there is and has been some discourse over, let's pull this up. There has been some discourse with the journey guide of Rotta the Hutt. That is to say that in these first two tiers, previously there was some MK7 material that players were able to get in order to make sure that their characters got to relic level 0 and that they would not have to purchase any G12 gear. That seems to not be here anymore, and I do believe that that is a major problem that CG really does need to solve. It would have been one thing if CG had made that clear to players at the beginning of the era. If players were given the information before they started to take out their credit cards, I would have no problem with this because effectively, for me, as somebody going to 7 stars, I do see that they've actually increased the rewards and made things better. Instead of those 8,000 era currency, I am essentially getting all of the material for R8, all of the material for R9, and all of the R8, R9 material needed for R10 in order to bring Rotta to Relic 10 if I really want to. And that is a very beneficial thing, and it is a huge increase in rewards for players bringing him to 7-star. However, for players who are only bringing Rotta to 5 stars, it is a big slap in the face. And this comes after multiple controversies that CG has had in the previous last 6 months, where they have made a phantom change and not told players about that change until it was too late or until players found out 6 weeks later, after they had already made an informed decision about their spending because they were expecting a specific thing and finding out that they were no longer going to be getting that specific thing. And to that, I say that yes, if you are one of those players, you 100% should be mad because it is your wallet, it is your choice to spend, and uh, every decision you make should be an informed decision. We do need to hold CG to a higher standard here to make sure that when they make changes to things that are going to fundamentally alter whether or not a player wants to spend, that those changes need to be made clear to players. If CG had so much as in the beginning of the era said, hey, in the Rotta event, we are going to be fundamentally altering the design of the rewards. Here is what happens, and here is what's happening. Then players would be making an informed decision, and whether or not the rewards increased or decreased, while you could be annoyed or not, at the very least, you could decide whether or not you wanted to do that spending. All of that said, TLDR, you skip to the end of the video, you're wondering what is Egnards talking about. Overall, Rotta the Hutt appears to be a cheaper option than the era of Andor, and technically the era, the era of anniversaries, and technically the era of Andor, if we don't consider the way that CG completely screwed things up and ended up having to give a ton of stuff away. And that is really great. But also that there is a little bit of a controversy in the Rotta the Hutt rewards. And yes, players should be talking about that a little bit more. With all of that said, I do hope you found this helpful. Those infographics that I have here, you are free to share those around as needed. Peace out and have a great rest of your day.